Atlus is a company that loves the intersection of ideas that should never be mashed together. My favorite of which is a frenetic arcade-style puzzle platformer that's also a grounded relationship drama about adulthood and maturity. How one goes from block puzzles and Babylonian gods to quiet, thoughtful scenes about love and marriage is beyond me. But it's undeniable that this fever dream concept results in something that's truly special. I've never been more ensnared by a narrative than the first time I played Catherine. It's a rich and layered story about maturity, responsibility, romance, sex, and freedom, and it's one of the only games I replay with any sort of frequency for more than just gameplay. There's something about Catherine's narrative that's tied to my enjoyment of the gameplay that I just can't bear to skip any of these cutscenes, even after 10 plus playthroughs. And I think that's because the gameplay here serves a purpose beyond just being enjoyable. As fun and unique as these puzzle sequences are, they lend a certain emotional weight to the story itself, which in turn amplifies the gameplay. Since the story of Catherine is essentially the story of Vincent Brooks, the game has to make sure the player not only likes this character, but has a desire to lead him to freedom. So it uses gameplay as a hands-on way of building a relationship between Vincent and the player that gets you to truly, deeply care about him as a character. What's unique about Catherine, both as a narrative and as a game, is that Vincent never really feels like just an avatar for the player to control. The game seems to encourage players to view him as his own person through narrative and mechanical choices that subconsciously separate the player's identity from Vincent's. For example, the player can select dialogue prompts for him, but he rarely follows them word for word, injecting his own vocabulary and voice into each prompt. This wouldn't be terribly unusual if the game utilized short, single-word commands for each dialogue prompt, but Catherine's prompts are typically full sentences, and the player is actually bound to Vincent's voice through the texting mechanic, allowing the latter a further sense of individuality. In fact, the narrative itself treats Vincent and the player as two separate beings, reinforcing that disconnect through the story's framing device. The Golden Playhouse is an in-universe TV show that's actually broadcasting the events of Catherine to the player, who's acknowledged by the program's host as an active agent in Vincent's story, but not as Vincent himself. This logo in the corner of every cutscene is not just a stylistic choice, but a subtle reminder that the actions of Vincent are separate from the actions of the player. The player's role is even acknowledged in-game, by text directly from the Golden Playhouse speaking to the player, which Vincent writes off as spam, along with a narrator whose sole purpose is to speak directly to them. The decision to frame the game as a story being told through a television show actively separates Vincent and the player through a metaphorical thin wall of glass, and that separation is incredibly important to getting players to relate to and respect this character. It's a daring choice to feature a character whose defining quality is being indecisive, but it also puts the game at high risk of losing the player's interest in Vincent's struggles. He's not a suave ladies' man who always knows what to say and what to do. He's a 32-year-old man in a shitty, dumpy apartment working a mundane job as a systems engineer who spends most of the story just trying to keep his life together. And his actions throughout the story, like lying and cheating on his girlfriend, don't exactly make him the type of character you'd want to project yourself onto. And that's because Vincent isn't meant to be an avatar or escapist fantasy for the player. He's a flawed individual that's meant to be empathized with and understood. Separating you from him subconsciously allows us to view him as an agent unto himself. Instead of projecting ourselves onto him, players are more likely to observe him from an objective lens. But merely understanding him isn't enough to get players to actually care about his success. Since Catherine is a game, they'll need a compelling reason to overcome the difficult puzzle sequences and reach the end. So the game's solution is to use the mechanics to help players empathize with him. For example, consider the mechanic that involves getting shit-faced drunk to prepare for the nightmare sequences. Vincent has a drinking problem, drowning his frustrations and anger through substance. And although he's a functioning alcoholic, his innermost monologue during these sequences showcases that the main reason he drinks is to escape his anxieties. This helps players get to know him at a narrative level, but making players press square to drink brings them closer together. Since drinking heavily before going to bed will allow you to move faster within the nightmare sequence, you're actually encouraged to enable Vincent. Vincent relies on alcohol to help him run from his problems in a metaphorical sense, and the player relies on alcohol to actually make him run faster, meaning the player depends on alcohol just as much as Vincent does, which is the type of abstract use of mechanics to support intangible emotional concepts that makes Catherine as compelling to play as it is to watch. And that's why I feel like playing Catherine, rather than watching a cutscene movie of it, is paramount if you want to fully experience the story, because gameplay here isn't just the bridge connecting story sequences. The puzzle gameplay acts as a complex metaphor for Vincent's emotional state. I'm not saying spike traps and bomb blocks are direct metaphors for pregnancy scares or mysterious death threats, but they're meant to elicit the same emotional response from the player that they do from Vincent. Vincent's story is a constant struggle to keep his life from falling apart in the face of an uncertain future that forces him to step up and move forward despite his apprehension. Thus, the mechanics of the puzzle sequence are made to reflect these emotions. A constantly falling floor leaves players with a tight time budget, so remaining stationary for too long will lead to demise. And the interconnected nature of the tower means every single move yields consequences. Stage hazards such as spike traps, heavy blocks, and hostile sheep also constantly hinder the player's ascent up the tower, so players are encouraged to move wisely and think critically, but at the same time, keep a constant momentum so that they don't fall behind. And that's a stressful feeling when you're staring at a sheer cliff of blocks with no clue how to advance while the ground below you drops into the abyss. This is best illustrated by the stage's bosses, which reappropriate the game's usual formula of climbing to survive by having the player attempt to outrun a manifestation of Vincent's fears. Giant babies, a machete-wielding Catherine in a wedding dress, and the physical embodiment of butt sex are all boss fights in this game, and oh.
Seriously, give me a break!
But they are effective in making Vincent's fears feel real to the player. Beyond symbolism and visual design, their attacks, voice lines, and stage layouts are all designed to magnify exactly what it is that Vincent's running from. The immoral beast represents Vincent's desire to give in to temptation, which confuses him. Players are thus forced to dodge a shower of hearts that can reverse the player's controls to disorient them. The child represents Vincent's fear of being weighed down by responsibility, so its boss form screams and wails at players while literally dragging them down with a shockwave attack. And the shadow of Vincent demonstrates conflict within the self, an inability to decide who he is and what he wants. So his boss form wears a mask that slowly crumbles to reveal a sinister face underneath while ensnaring the stage in darkness, making the path forward uncertain. Witnessing Vincent's fears and frustrations firsthand gives an excellent motivation for the player to outrun them at night, and the responsibility the player feels in leading Vincent to success will go on to fuel an interest in the narrative. And along with sharing a sense of fear, the player and Vincent are further linked by a shared sense of morality. Catherine offers players an opportunity to choose the ending they want through a fairly simple morality system. The system doesn't actually affect the direction of the story, merely the ending, but it further connects the player to Vincent by influencing the way he thinks during crucial plot-specific sequences. Not only does it draw the player and Vincent together, it also gives the player a stake in the story that further compels them to see it through to the end. Narrative has the power to dramatically enhance the impact of the gameplay, but to do so, the player has to be invested in the outcome.
If I become number one, will you do it with me?
So Catherine offers both Vincent and the player a choice, materialized through the two Catherines. But unlike an otome game or dating sim, the two women aren't ideal endings based on player preferences. The distant and cold Catherine is equally as flawed and possibly off-putting as the domineering and easily angered Catherine, but they both have their own appeal. Underneath Catherine's cold exterior is a genuine love and concern for Vincent, while the other Catherine's hair-trigger temper and violent behavior is really just a byproduct for a fiery passion for hedonism and self-pleasure. Oh, and they're both fucking hot. Like, in very different ways, but damn. The women also represent two very different lifestyles and futures for Vincent, encouraging players to draw on their desires for their own ideal life when deciding what outcome they think is right for Vincent. What makes this system interesting is how it ties into decision-making. The binary system at play offers only two possible alignments, order and chaos, and the player has to be fully dedicated to either one to reach the true ending for each Catherine, with a secret ending existing for players who remain in the middle. Since the narrative paints Vincent as uncertain towards his own desires, the questions and quandaries the player face are oftentimes challenging and uncomfortable. The order path means stifling sexual passion, giving up desire, and living modestly, while chaos means rejecting peace, tranquility, and isolation. And if you're anything like me, you're probably a good mix of both. So answering honestly means your morality is constantly fluctuating toward one or the other. These questions are meant to challenge the player as much as they do Vincent, showcasing that, even if your desire towards order or chaos is stronger, being able to fully abstain from either is difficult, which is the root of Vincent's apprehensions. And while I think this system is effective, it's betrayed by its own harsh moral judgment. The binary morality presented here isn't necessarily a problem. making complicated moral quandaries so binary is part of the challenge of the system. But the weaknesses of the system are really exposed when the game drops incredibly mundane questions on you and then assigns heavy moral implications onto them.
Would you be able to have sex with a ghost if you found it very attractive? Do you enjoy popping bubble wrap? What do you think about the usage of underwear?
These questions are things you'd ask at a sleepover, but apparently ancient Babylonian gods use them to judge you for all time. It also doesn't help that the player's morality doesn't actually affect the narrative until the ending. Telling Catherine to go fuck herself at every turn and replying to every pinup picture the other Catherine sends you still has Vincent treat her like a burden for him, when in reality, the player's input would imply he'd want to indulge in her company. Having huge gaps between the player's desires and Vincent's actions within the bulk of the story puts the relationship between the two at jeopardy. It's an unfortunate blemish on what is otherwise an effective symbiosis between player and protagonist, and it is that very symbiosis that makes Catherine's bizarre tale hit home. Your involvement in the story, through choice and skillful gameplay, is felt so much more once you finally reach the ending. Knowing that both Vincent and the player receive the happy ending they decided on together really exemplifies what makes it a wonderful game. After the final boss, the Midnight Venus makes one last appearance to discuss the events of the story with the player, before revealing that, spoilers, the entire game was actually a brilliant metaphor for navigating life, with the Tower of Blocks representing the problems we all face, and the Tower's open-endedness representing how there is no one true path in life.
Games are lovely creations, aren't they?
Yeah, sure fucking are. While the scene is abrasive, it still says something very important. Having control over the direction a story takes and having to be responsible for seeing an experience through to the end through competence, action, and determination changes the way we engage in a narrative. While there's always something to be gleaned from witnessing a story through cutscenes, actually playing it means experiencing what the story is trying to say firsthand. Vincent begins the story with no direction or ambition, and makes frequent mistakes throughout his insane journey to adulthood. But by the end, he's a changed man, with a newfound confidence to seize life for himself. The player will also repeatedly make mistakes on their way to the top of the tower, falling to traps, ruining pathways, and dying repeatedly. But by grappling with the systems at play and learning from your mistakes, you'll eventually reach the top and find true freedom at the end. The connection between player and protagonist is meant to motivate you to help Vincent succeed, but that relationship also holds a great deal of insight for the player. Mechanics are the language of video games, and connecting the set of mechanics to this particular story relays a powerful message to the player about tenacity and adaptiveness on their own climb to maturity. Making mistakes is a part of growing up, and growing up doesn't necessarily stop at a certain age. It's okay if you mess up, trip, stumble, and fall. Those are all necessary steps on the journey to adulthood. You'll find your way as long as you learn, grow, and always remember to keep climbing.